The dinner rush at Mercy's diner had died down to its usual Tuesday evening whisper when Maya Chen noticed the man in the corner booth frantically patting his baby's back. The infant's face was turning an alarming shade of purple, tiny fists clenched as silence filled the space where crying should have been. Maya's hands, still sticky from wiping down tables with the industrial cleaner that never quite masked the smell of old grease and desperation, froze mid-motion. The man, tall, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent, held his daughter with the careful desperation of someone who had everything to lose and no idea how to save what mattered most. His wedding ring caught the harsh fluorescent light as he lifted the baby higher, his voice breaking as he called out, "Help! Please, someone help!" Maya didn't think. 23 years of life had taught her that thinking too long meant missing the moment that mattered. She dropped the gray dish rag onto table 6 and moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent countless hours navigating between cramped tables and impatient customers. Her sneakers, worn down to cardboard-thin soles, made no sound on the cracked linoleum as she approached. "Sir, may I?" Her voice carried the steady calm that came from years of diffusing situations, whether it was a drunk customer getting handsy or a child having a meltdown over spilled chocolate milk. She didn't wait for permission. The infant, maybe 8 months old, with downy dark hair and skin that should have been pink but was now mottled blue, was running out of time. Maya had learned infant CPR during her brief stint as a nanny 3 summers ago, back when she still believed college was just temporarily out of reach. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose grandchildren she'd watched, had insisted on the certification. "You never know when you'll need to save a life, dear," she had said in her paper-thin voice. Maya had thought it was paranoia then. Now, as she positioned the baby face down along her forearm, supporting the tiny head with her palm, she whispered a silent thank you to Mrs. Patterson's worried heart. 5 firm blows between the shoulder blades. The technique came back like muscle memory, though her hands trembled with the weight of responsibility. The diner had gone completely quiet, except for the hum of the ancient refrigerator behind the counter and the soft jazz that never quite fit the atmosphere, but played anyway. Even Jimmy, the night cook, who usually narrated every order with colorful commentary, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his spatula dripping forgotten onto the floor. The first blow yielded nothing. The second brought a small grunt from the baby, but no relief. Maya flipped the infant over, supporting the back of her head, and began chest compressions with 2 fingers, just below the nipple line. She counted silently, 1, 2, 3, while the father watched with eyes that held the particular brand of terror reserved for parents who realize their child's life hangs in someone else's hands. "Come on, sweetheart," Maya murmured, her voice barely audible. "Come on, little one." On the 4th compression, something shifted. A tiny cough, then another, and suddenly the baby was crying, that beautiful, piercing sound that every parent both dreads and desperately needs to hear. A small piece of what looked like a dinner roll flew from the infant's mouth and landed on Maya's uniform, the burgundy polyester that marked her as just another service worker in a world full of people who needed things. The baby's cries filled the diner like music, and Maya felt her knees go weak with relief. She carefully handed the child back to her father, whose hands shook as he accepted his daughter, pressing her close to his chest and whispering words that sounded like prayers in a language Maya didn't recognize but understood perfectly. "Thank you," he said, looking up at Maya with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if—" Maya stepped back, suddenly aware that every eye in the diner was on her. Mrs. Rodriguez, the regular who came in every Tuesday for coffee and pie, was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Tony, the trucker who'd been complaining about his burger being too cold just minutes before, sat in stunned silence. Even Dolores, the owner, who usually stayed locked in her office counting receipts and muttering about overhead costs, had emerged to witness the aftermath of near tragedy averted. "It's okay," Maya said, though her voice came out rougher than intended. "She's okay now. That's what matters." The man, who introduced himself as David something or other, though Maya missed the last name in her post-adrenaline fog, insisted on staying until paramedics arrived to check his daughter. He called them himself, speaking in the clipped, authoritative tone of someone accustomed to having his requests treated as priorities. While they waited, he asked Maya about herself with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize every detail of the person who had just saved what he valued most. She told him the basics because it seemed rude not to. Maya Chen, 23, born in San Francisco but living here in Millbrook for the past 2 years. She'd moved here after her mother's cancer treatment had drained their savings and forced her to leave the city where rent was a luxury they could no longer afford. She worked double shifts at Mercy's Diner most days, trying to save enough to maybe go back to school someday, though someday felt increasingly theoretical.
She didn't mention the stack of medical bills that arrived like clockwork every month, each envelope a reminder that saving her mother's life had come at a price that would take years to pay. She didn't mention the tiny apartment above the hardware store where she lived alone now, where she kept her mother's reading glasses on the nightstand, even though they'd been useless for the past 6 months. She didn't mention that she'd been on her feet for 11 hours already and still had 3 hours of cleanup ahead of her before she could go home to leftover cakeout and the kind of exhaustion that settled into your bones and never fully left. What she did mention was her love for working with children, how she'd always been drawn to their resilience and honesty. She talked about Mrs. Patterson in the CPR class, about how you never really know when something you learned will matter. She found herself sharing more than usual, maybe because of the adrenaline, or maybe because David listened with the rare intensity of someone who had just been reminded that strangers could be angels. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of equipment and gentle efficiency. They checked the baby, whose name was Sophia, Maya learned, and confirmed that she was perfectly fine. A piece of bread had gotten lodged just enough to block her airway, they explained, but Maya's quick action had prevented any lasting damage. They praised her technique with the professional recognition that comes from seeing too many situations end differently. As the paramedics packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, David stood with Sophia in his arms, looking at Maya with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was gratitude, certainly, but something else too, a thoughtfulness that suggested he was seeing not just what she had done, but who she was. "I need to do something," he said finally, "to show my gratitude. This, what you did, it changes everything." Maya shook her head, uncomfortable with the weight of his attention now that the crisis had passed. "Really, you don't need to. My daughter is alive because of you," he interrupted, his voice carrying a conviction that made the statement feel like an immutable fact. "Please, let me at least give you something." He reached into his wallet and pulled out what Maya initially thought was a business card. Instead, it was a check, written out in his careful handwriting for an amount that made her eyes widen. $5,000, more money than she'd see in 6 months of double shifts and Tuesday night regulars who tipped in quarters. "I can't take this," she said automatically, though her practical mind was already calculating how much of her mother's medical debt that amount would cover. "You already took it," David replied with a small smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely warm. "By saving my daughter's life, the check is just paperwork." Before Maya could protest further, he was gathering Sophia's diaper bag and heading for the door. He paused at the threshold, turning back with that same thoughtful expression. "This isn't over," he said, and something in his tone suggested it was both a promise and a statement of fact. "I'll be in touch." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the check that Maya held like it might disappear if she breathed on it wrong. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Jimmy went back to his grill, Mrs. Rodriguez finished her pie, and Tony paid his check and left a surprisingly generous tip. But Maya remained frozen in the aftermath of an encounter that felt too significant to be real. Dolores emerged from her office again, studying Maya with the shrewd assessment of someone who had been running a small business long enough to recognize when something extraordinary had just happened under her fluorescent lights. "You did good, kid," she said, which was as close to effusive praise as Dolores ever got. "Real good." Maya nodded, still holding the check, still trying to process the last 30 minutes of her life. She had saved a baby's life. A man had given her more money than she'd ever held at one time. And somehow, standing in the harsh light of Mercy's diner, with the smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee filling her lungs, she had the strangest feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. The check was real, the baby was safe, and somewhere in the city, David, whoever he was tucking his daughter into her crib and trying to figure out how to thank the waitress who had given him back his world. Maya folded the check carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket, next to her order pad and the pen that never worked properly. Tomorrow she would deposit it and pay off 2 months' worth of medical bills. Tonight she would finish cleaning tables and wonder what it meant when someone looked at you like you'd just performed a miracle, when all you'd done was remember something you learned 3 summers ago from a worried grandmother who understood that love sometimes meant preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The last customer left at 11:30, and Maya began the familiar ritual of closing down the diner. But as she wiped down the booth where David had sat with his daughter, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story was just beginning, that the check in her pocket was less an ending than an opening, the first page of something she couldn't yet imagine but was already walking towards, one careful step at a time. Maya's alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before she actually needed to get up, but 13 minutes after she'd already been awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the pipes in the building next door gurgle their morning complaints. The check from David had been sitting on her kitchen table for 4 days now, a pale blue rectangle that seemed to glow with possibility every time she passed it. She'd held it so many times that the edges were starting to soften, but she still couldn't quite bring herself to drive to the bank. $5,000. The number felt abstract, like a word in a foreign language she'd never learned to speak. Maya had been poor for so long that money had become purely functional. Enough for rent, not enough for rent. Enough for groceries, enough for gas, but not groceries. She'd never had enough for anything that wasn't immediately necessary, never had the luxury of money that existed just to exist, waiting patiently for her to decide what dreams it might purchase. Her apartment above Chen's hardware store, no relation, just one of those cosmic coincidences that made Mrs. Chen from downstairs assume they were family and slip her leftover dumplings on holidays, was the kind of place that looked bigger in online listings than in reality. One room that functioned as bedroom, living room, and dining room, separated from the kitchenette by a counter that had been white sometime in the previous decade. The bathroom was so small that Maya had learned to brush her teeth while sitting on the toilet, and the shower head hung at an angle that suggested it had given up on life sometime around the Clinton administration. But it was hers, and the rent was manageable, and Mrs. Chen downstairs fixed anything that broke without raising her monthly payment. Maya had learned to find beauty in small spaces and smaller budgets. She'd hung white curtains from the discount store to soften the harsh morning light. She'd rescued plants from the dumpster behind the garden center, spider plants and pothos that were too leggy for retail, but perfect for someone who understood that sometimes the things other people threw away were just waiting for a second chance. The morning routine was the same every day, because routine was free and comfort was not. Instant coffee from the jar that had been on sale 3 weeks ago, toast from the bread that would go stale if she didn't eat it today, a few minutes standing at the single window looking down on Main Street as Millbrook woke up with the deliberate pace of a town that had never been in a hurry to get anywhere. Maya had moved to Millbrook because it was where her mother's insurance would cover treatment at the regional medical center, and because the cost of living was low enough that she could work and still spend hours in waiting rooms and hospital corridors. She'd planned to leave as soon as the treatments were finished, to go back to San Francisco and pick up the threads of the life she'd put on hold. But her mother's battle with cancer had lasted longer than anyone expected, and Maya had found herself settling into the rhythm of small-town life almost without noticing.
She'd grown to love the way Mrs. Patterson, yes, the same Mrs. Patterson who had insisted on CPR certification, would wave from her porch every morning. She'd grown fond of the way Mr. Kim at the gas station would save her a day-old donut if he knew she was working a double shift. She'd even grown attached to Dolores's particular brand of gruff affection, the way she would slip an extra dinner roll onto Maya's meal break plate when she thought no one was looking. But love and attachment didn't pay medical bills, and they didn't erase the numbers that arrived in those monthly envelopes with their letterhead and their polite language and their absolute certainty that debts must be paid. Maya had become an expert at medical billing, on payment plans and hardship applications, at the particular dance you had to do when you owed more money than you'd ever seen and needed to convince people that you were trying your best with what you had. The check could change everything. Maya knew this the way she knew that rain was coming when her mother's old arthritis would have acted up if her mother had still been alive to feel the pressure changes in her joints. $5,000 would clear the remaining balance on the oncology bills. It would give her enough breathing room to think beyond next month's rent and this week's groceries. It might even let her start thinking about college again, about the nursing degree she'd abandoned when her mother got sick and priorities shifted like tectonic plates beneath her feet. Maya walked to work because her car had developed a concerning rattle that sounded expensive, and because the 20-minute walk gave her time to think without distractions. Millbrook in October was painted in colors that belonged in coffee shop art, russet and gold, and the particular shade of brown that comes from leaves giving up their summer green in graceful defeat. The air smelled like wood smoke and possibility, that autumn scent that made even practical people think about fresh starts and new chapters.
Mercy's diner at 6:30 a.m. was a temple to the working class, filled with people who started their days before sunrise and ended them long after the rest of the world had settled into evening routines. There was Tony the trucker, bent over his coffee and eggs like a man praying to the gods of caffeine and cholesterol. There was Maria from the medical center, still in scrubs from her night shift, reading yesterday's newspaper because today hadn't had time to catch up with her yet. There was old Mr. Henderson, who came in every morning and ordered the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, 2 eggs over easy, and left a $1 tip with mathematical precision. Maya tied her apron and began the familiar ballet of morning service. Coffee first, always coffee, because people before 8 a.m. were basically zombies who needed caffeine to become human. Then the careful attention to each customer's particular needs and preferences, the way Mrs. Rodriguez liked her eggs scrambled dry, the way Tommy from the auto shop always asked for extra butter on his pancakes but would eat them plain if she forgot. It was honest work, Maya reminded herself as she refilled coffee cups and memorized orders without writing them down. There was dignity in serving people food, in being part of the routine that started their days and sent them out into the world properly fed and caffeinated. She was good at it, too. Good at remembering preferences, good at diffusing tension when customers were running late and patience was thin, good at making people feel seen and cared for during the brief interaction that bracketed their breakfast. But honest work didn't make the numbers on the medical bills smaller, and dignity didn't pay rent. Maya had been working at Mercy's for 2 years, and in that time she'd watched other young people come and go, some moving on to better opportunities, some moving away from Millbrook entirely, some settling into the comfortable rhythm of small-town life and the jobs that came with it. She'd started to wonder which category she belonged in, whether she was waiting for opportunity or simply waiting. The morning rush was particularly busy, maybe because the weather was turning and people wanted comfort food before facing the promise of winter. Maya moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her mind split between immediate tasks: table 4 needs more orange juice, table 2 is ready to order, the coffee pot is getting low, and the larger questions that had been circling her thoughts for days. What did David want from her? His final words, "This isn't over," sounded less like gratitude and more like intention. Maya had looked him up online during her break the day before, typing his name into the ancient computer in Dolores's office. David Ashford. The search results had made her stomach drop in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. David Ashford wasn't just wealthy, he was billionaire wealthy.
The kind of rich that came with magazine profiles and charity galas and a net worth that required scientific notation to comprehend fully. He owned a technology company that made something Maya didn't entirely understand, but that was apparently essential to how the internet worked. He lived in a mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines, a sprawling estate outside the city that looked more like a resort than a home. He was recently widowed, the articles mentioned, his wife having died in a car accident when Sophia was just 2 months old. Maya had stared at the photos of his house, all glass and clean lines and the kind of expensive minimalism that looked effortless but probably cost more than most people made in a decade, and felt a peculiar mix of intimidation and sympathy. David had everything money could buy, but money couldn't bring back his wife or eliminate the fear that must come with raising a baby alone when your wealth made you a target and your grief made you vulnerable. She'd closed the browser feeling more confused than before. Why would someone like David Ashford care about thanking a waitress beyond the check he'd already given her? What could someone like her possibly offer someone like him? Maya was good at her job and kind to her customers and responsible with what little money she had, but those weren't the kind of qualities that usually interested billionaires. The lunch rush was slower, giving Maya time to think between orders. She found herself watching the door, half expecting David to walk in with Sophia, though that was ridiculous. People like David Ashford didn't eat at places like Mercy's Diner. They had private chefs and personal assistants and reservations at restaurants where the waitstaff wore black instead of burgundy polyester, and the menus didn't have laminated pages or pictures of the food. But Maya kept watching anyway, and when 3 p.m. came and went, without any sign of expensive suits or grateful billionaires, she felt something that might have been disappointment mixed with relief. Her life was complicated enough without adding whatever this situation was supposed to become. Maya's shift ended at 4 p.m., but she stayed late to help Jimmy prep for the dinner rush, because staying busy was easier than going home to sit alone with her thoughts and the check that waited on her kitchen table like a test she hadn't studied for. By the time she finally walked home, the autumn sun was painting everything in shades of gold that made even the most ordinary things look like they'd been touched by magic. She climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, past Mrs. Chen's door, where the smell of ginger and star anise suggested something delicious was happening behind the peeling paint, and into her own small space that felt smaller than usual after spending the day thinking about mansions and lives lived at scales she couldn't imagine. The check was where she'd left it, next to the stack of mail she hadn't opened yet, because some conversations with creditors could wait until tomorrow or next week, or until she figured out what she was supposed to do with money that felt too significant to spend and too generous to keep. Maya made dinner from the contents of her nearly empty refrigerator, scrambled eggs with the last of the cheese, toast from bread that was a day past its prime but still acceptable. She ate standing at the counter. Looking out at Main Street as Millbrook settled into evening, Mrs. Patterson was on her porch with her evening cup of tea, waving at neighbors as they passed. Mr. Kim was closing up the gas station with the methodical precision of someone who'd been performing the same routine for decades. Tommy from the auto shop drove by in his pickup truck, windows down despite the cool air, radio playing something that made him tap his fingers against the steering wheel. It was a good life, Maya realized. Not the life she'd planned, maybe, but a life nonetheless. She had people who knew her name and cared whether she showed up in the morning. She had work that mattered, even in small ways. She had a place to live and enough to eat, and the particular satisfaction that came from paying her bills on time, even when paying them took everything she had. The check could change all of that, could give her options she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. But change was risky, and Maya had learned to be careful with risk. She'd seen what happened when people reached for more than they could handle, when hope turned into disappointment and dreams became debts you couldn't pay. She put the check back on the table and went to bed early, setting her alarm for 5:47 a.m. because tomorrow was another day at Mercy's Diner, another day of coffee and eggs and customers who needed someone to remember how they liked their toast. It was enough, Maya told herself as she fell asleep. It had to be enough,
because wanting more was dangerous, and she'd already used up her lifetime's allotment of dangerous when she'd lost her mother to a disease that took everything they had and still wasn't satisfied. But even as she drifted off to sleep, Maya found herself wondering what David Ashford was doing at that moment. Whether he was reading bedtime stories to Sophia in a nursery that cost more than most people's homes. Whether he was thinking about the waitress who'd saved his daughter's life and what that might mean for both of their futures. Maya was wiping down the coffee machine when she noticed the black sedan parked across from Mercy's diner. It had been there for 3 days now, appearing each morning around the time she started her shift and disappearing sometime after she left in the evening. The car was expensive but not flashy, the kind of vehicle that whispered money rather than shouting it, and Maya had developed the uncomfortable feeling that it was watching her. She'd mentioned it to Jimmy during their slow afternoon prep time, pointing through the window at the tinted glass that reflected nothing but street and sky. "You notice that car's been there all week?" Jimmy had squinted through the kitchen pass-through, his weathered face creasing with the kind of suspicion that came from 40 years of observing human nature through the lens of breakfast orders and late-night drunks. "Could be anything. Could be someone casing the place. Could be someone waiting for something. Could be you're being paranoid because rich people make you nervous." The last observation stung, because it was accurate. Maya had been nervous ever since she'd looked up David Ashford online. Nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the uncomfortable awareness that she was swimming in waters far deeper than anything she'd navigated before. Rich people lived by different rules, operated with different expectations, and Maya had no roadmap for understanding what someone like David might want from someone like her. The answer came on Thursday morning, in the form of a woman who walked into Mercy's diner like she owned the place and every piece of land for miles around it. She was probably 50, dressed in a cream-colored suit that managed to look both professional and approachable, with the kind of jewelry that whispered rather than shouted its value. Her smile was warm and genuine, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to evaluating situations quickly and acting accordingly. "Maya Chen?" she asked, approaching the counter where Maya was organizing the morning's receipts. "That's me," Maya replied, immediately on guard. Strangers who knew her name and looked like they had money usually meant complications she couldn't afford. "My name is Catherine Wells. I work for David Ashford." She extended a manicured hand that Maya shook with her own work-roughened fingers. "He'd very much like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." Maya glanced around the diner. It was 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning, the dead zone between breakfast and lunch, when her most demanding customers were the coffee regulars who came for caffeine and conversation rather than food. Dolores was in her office, Jimmy was prepping vegetables for the lunch rush, and the handful of customers were settled with their newspapers and crossword puzzles. "It's suppose," Maya said, though every instinct told her this conversation was going to change something she wasn't ready to have changed. "Thank you," Catherine smiled, and gestured toward the back booth, the same one that David had sat with Sophia 5 days ago when Maya's life had taken a sudden left turn into territory she was still trying to map. "This won't take long, but it's important." They sat across from each other, and Maya found herself studying Catherine with the particular attention she reserved for customers who might be difficult or demanding. But Catherine didn't feel difficult. She felt careful, like someone who understood that the conversation they were about to have mattered in ways that went beyond immediate courtesy. "David asked me to come speak with you because he wasn't sure you'd be comfortable meeting with him directly. He's very aware that what happened the other night, what you did for Sophia, created an unusual situation. He wants to express his gratitude properly, but he also wants to respect your boundaries and your autonomy." Maya nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what autonomy meant in this context. "The check was very generous. More than generous, actually. I haven't cashed it yet because—" She stopped, unsure how to explain the complex mix of pride and practicality that had kept the check on her kitchen table for nearly a week. "Because it feels like charity," Catherine finished gently. "Because you don't want to be someone who takes handouts.
even when the handout comes from a place of genuine gratitude for an extraordinary act of kindness and skill. Something like that, Maya admitted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Catherine opened the portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper covered in David's careful handwriting. David anticipated this reaction. He asked me to share something with you that might help explain why this situation feels so important to him. Maya took the letter, noticing that her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. David's handwriting was neat and controlled, the kind of penmanship that suggested expensive private schools and careful attention to detail. Dear Maya, I've been thinking about how to thank you properly for saving Sophia's life, and I realized that conventional gratitude feels inadequate for what you did. You acted without hesitation, without expectation of reward, without any knowledge of who we were or what our circumstances might be. You saved my daughter because she needed saving, and because you had the skills and courage to do what needed to be done. But I want you to understand what Sophia means to me, what losing her would have cost. She's all I have left of my wife, Elena, who died in a car accident when Sophia was 2 months old. Elena and I had planned to have several children, to fill our home with laughter and chaos and all the beautiful disorder that comes with a large family. When Elena died, those dreams died with her. Sophia became not just my daughter, but my only connection to the future Elena and I had imagined together. When I saw Sophia choking, when I realized I might lose her too, I felt something break inside me that I'm not sure could have been repaired. You didn't just save Sophia's life, you saved mine as well, and the life we'll build together as she grows up. You preserved something irreplaceable, and I need you to understand that no amount of money could possibly represent the true value of what you did. The check I gave you is not charity. It's an inadequate attempt to acknowledge a debt that can never truly be repaid. Please, cash it, and use it to improve your own life in whatever way feels right to you. You deserve good things, Maya Chen. You deserve opportunities and choices and the kind of security that lets you take risks and chase dreams without worrying about whether you'll be able to pay rent or buy groceries. But more than that, I'd like to offer you something else. A job, if you're interested. A position that would let you use your natural instincts for care and protection in ways that might be more fulfilling than serving coffee and eggs to people who probably don't appreciate how lucky they are to have you watching over them. I need someone to help me with Sophia. Someone I can trust completely with the most precious thing in my world. Not a nanny. I've had nannies, and they were professional, but not invested. I need someone who would save her life without thinking twice, who would put her safety and happiness above convenience or protocol, someone who would love her as fiercely as I do, because that's what she deserves. The salary would be $150,000 per year, plus health insurance, plus housing if you want it. There's a guest house on my property that would be yours to use completely private, with everything you need to be comfortable and independent. You'd work normal hours with weekends off unless there was an emergency. You'd have 2 weeks paid vacation to start, increasing to 4 weeks after your first year. I know this is sudden and probably overwhelming. I know you don't know me well enough to trust me, and I know that accepting would mean leaving the life you've built in Millbrook. But I also know that you're meant for bigger things than serving coffee to people who can't see how extraordinary you are. Sophia needs you. I need you. And I think maybe we might be able to offer you something you need as well. Take time to think about it. Catherine will answer any questions you might have, and she has my complete authority to negotiate any terms that would make this arrangement work for everyone involved. But please, cash the check. Consider it a signing bonus whether you decide to work for us or not. You earned it, and I'll sleep better at night knowing that someone who saves babies doesn't have to worry about paying her bills. With gratitude and respect, David Ashford. Maya read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to process information that felt too significant to absorb all at once. $150,000 per year. More money than she'd ever imagined making. More money than her parents had made combined in their best years. Health insurance, which meant no more careful rationing of doctor visits or prescription medications. A place to live that wouldn't require her to choose between rent and groceries, between heat and electricity. And Sophia, the baby whose life she'd saved, would become her responsibility, her daily purpose. Maya had always loved working with children, had always felt most like herself when she was caring for someone who needed protection and guidance. The job David was offering wasn't just employment. It was the chance to matter in someone's life in ways that went beyond taking orders and refilling coffee cups.
This is... Maya started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Overwhelming, life-changing, terrifying. All of those things, certainly, but also something else. An opportunity that felt too good to be true, which, in Maya's experience, usually meant it probably was. "I know it's a lot," Catherine said gently. "David was very specific that you shouldn't feel pressured to decide quickly. This offer stands for as long as you need to think about it." "What's the catch?" Maya asked, because there was always a catch. In her experience, good things came with hidden costs, and extraordinary things came with costs that could destroy you if you weren't careful. Catherine smiled, the first genuinely amused expression Maya had seen from her. "Direct. I like that. The catch is that you'd be working for someone whose wealth makes him a target for people with various agendas. There would be security considerations, background checks, privacy agreements. You'd be signing on to a life that includes bodyguards and security cameras, and careful attention to who knows what about your whereabouts and your connection to the Ashford family." Maya nodded, though the reality of that kind of wealth was still abstract to her. She'd never known anyone rich enough to need bodyguards, never lived anywhere that required security cameras or worried about people who might want to use her to get to someone else. "Also," Catherine continued, "you'd be raising a child who will grow up with every advantage money can provide, and some challenges that come specifically from having advantages most people can't imagine. Sophia will never want for anything material, but she'll also never have the luxury of anonymity or the freedom to make mistakes without consequences that extend beyond herself. It's a complicated responsibility." Maya folded the letter carefully, her mind racing through implications and possibilities she'd never had reason to consider before. "Can I ask you something? Why me? I mean, David could hire anyone. Professional nannies with years of experience, people with degrees in child development, people who actually know what they're doing." "Because," Catherine said, leaning forward slightly, "those people would do their jobs professionally and competently, but they wouldn't love Sophia the way she needs to be loved. David doesn't want someone who sees caring for his daughter as employment. He wants someone who sees it as a calling, someone who would act without thinking when she's in danger, someone who would put her needs above everything else because that's just who they are." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Rodriguez, who shuffled in for her usual afternoon coffee and pie. Maya excused herself to take care of the regular who had been coming to Mercy's longer than Maya had been working there, grateful for the brief respite from a conversation that was reshaping her understanding of what her life might become. As she poured coffee and cut a slice of apple pie, Maya found herself studying Mrs. Rodriguez with new eyes. She was probably 70, widowed for the past 5 years, living on Social Security and the small pension from her late husband's job at the textile mill that had closed down a decade ago. She came to Mercy's every Tuesday and Thursday for coffee and pie because it was the one small luxury she allowed herself, the one reminder that life could still hold small pleasures even when your world had contracted to the size of a studio apartment and the distance you could walk without getting winded. Maya had always enjoyed Mrs. Rodriguez's stories about her grandchildren, her gentle complaints about the weather, her careful attention to the price of everything she ordered. She represented the kind of customer Maya had grown to love, the regulars who came not just for food, but for the brief human connection that made their days feel less lonely and more purposeful. If Maya took David's job, she would leave all of this behind. Mrs. Rodriguez would have to ask someone else to remember that she liked her coffee with just a splash of cream and her pie warmed but not too hot. Tony the trucker would have to explain to a new waitress that he always ordered his eggs over easy but liked them cooked a little longer than most people did. Mr. Henderson would have to find someone else who understood that his dollar tip represented careful budgeting rather than cheapness, that it was the gesture that mattered rather than the amount. Maya had built a life in Millbrook. Small and constrained though it might be, she had people who knew her, who depended on her in tiny ways that added up to something that felt like belonging. Leaving would mean abandoning not just a job, but a community that had accepted her and given her purpose during the most difficult period of her life. But staying meant accepting limitations that felt increasingly arbitrary. Maya was 23 years old, smart and capable and full of energy that deserved better outlets than refilling coffee cups and memorizing breakfast orders. She had dreams that had been deferred so long they'd started to feel like fantasies, but David's offer suggested that maybe they didn't have to remain fantasies forever. When Maya returned to the booth, Catherine was checking messages on her phone with the efficient focus of someone whose time was valuable and carefully managed. She looked up as Maya sat down, her expression expectant but patient. "I need to ask about Sophia. What's she like? What would I be getting into?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Catherine's face softened, taking on the warmth that comes from talking about a child she clearly cared about. She's 8 months old, just starting to crawl everywhere and get into everything. She's curious and fearless in the way that babies are when they haven't learned to be afraid of the world yet. She laughs when you make funny faces, and she has this way of staring at people like she's trying to figure out what they're thinking.
She's been through a lot for someone so young, Catherine continued. Losing her mother, the choking incident, all the disruption that comes with David trying to figure out how to be a single parent while running a company and dealing with his own grief. She needs stability, someone who will be consistently present and emotionally available, someone who understands that children need more than just physical care. They need love and attention and the feeling that they matter to the adults in their lives. Maya nodded, thinking about the brief moments she'd held Sophia during the choking incident. Even in distress, the baby had felt solid and real in her arms, a complete person deserving of protection and care. The idea of being responsible for that small life, of watching her grow and learn and become whoever she was meant to be, felt both terrifying and deeply appealing. "What about David?" Maya asked. "What's he like as a person, not just as Sophia's father?" Catherine considered the question carefully, in the way that suggested she took her responsibility to both David and Maya seriously. "He's a good man who's been through something that would break most people. Losing Elena nearly destroyed him, and he's still learning how to live in a world where she doesn't exist. He loves Sophia desperately, but he's terrified of making mistakes that might harm her. He works too much because work is something he can control, unlike grief or parenthood or the randomness that can take away everything that matters in the space of a heartbeat. He's also brilliant and kind and more generous than he probably should be, given how many people want things from him. He remembers the names of everyone who works for him and asks about their families and their goals. He pays for his employees' children to go to college, and he's funded 3 different scholarship programs for kids from low-income families. He's not perfect,
He can be demanding when he's focused on something, and he sometimes forgets that not everyone operates at his level of intensity. But he's someone you can trust, someone who keeps his word and treats people with respect regardless of their position or their bank account. Maya absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the picture Catherine was painting with her own assumptions about wealthy people. In her experience, money usually came with arrogance and entitlement, with a kind of casual cruelty that emerged when people stopped seeing service workers as fully human. But David had been different that night in the diner, grateful without being condescending, concerned without being dramatic, present in the moment without the distraction that wealth usually brought. When would he need an answer? Maya asked, surprising herself with the question. She hadn't consciously decided to consider the offer seriously, but apparently some part of her mind had moved past whether into when. There's no deadline, but I will say that David is someone who makes decisions quickly when he knows what he wants. He's convinced that you're the right person for this job, and he's prepared to wait as long as necessary for you to reach the same conclusion. Maya glanced around the diner, taking in the familiar sights and sounds that had become the backdrop of her daily life. Jimmy was singing along to the radio in the kitchen, slightly off-key, but enthusiastic. Mrs. Rodriguez was reading a romance novel while she sipped her coffee, occasionally making small sounds of approval or dismay, depending on what the characters were doing. Tony had come in for his afternoon coffee break, automatically heading for his usual table without needing to be seated. It was a good life, Maya reminded herself, simple and honest, and full of people who cared about each other in the understated way that small towns fostered. But it was also a limited life, bounded by financial constraints and geographical realities that made dreams feel more like wishes than plans. I need to think about it, Maya said. It's a lot to process. Of course, Catherine agreed, closing the portfolio and preparing to leave. Take all the time you need. But do me one favor. Cash the check. David is right. You earned it, and there are no strings attached, regardless of what you decide about the job offer. After Catherine left, Maya found herself moving through the rest of her shift in a kind of daze. She took orders and refilled coffee cups and made small talk with customers, but part of her mind was elsewhere, imagining what it would be like to live in a guest house on an estate outside the city, to spend her days caring for a baby that would grow up with every advantage the world could provide. The afternoon passed slowly, marked by the familiar rhythms of a small-town diner in the quiet hours between lunch and dinner. Maya found herself paying closer attention to everything: the way the afternoon light slanted through the front windows, the comfortable chatter of customers who knew each other's names and stories, the particular satisfaction that came from doing work that was honest and necessary, even if it wasn't glamorous. When her shift ended at 4 p.m., Maya walked home more slowly than usual, taking the long way past the park where children played on swings that needed paint and slides that had been installed sometime in the previous decade. She watched a young mother pushing her toddler on a swing, both of them laughing as the child demanded, "Higher, higher," in the fearless way that only very young children could manage. She tried to imagine herself in that scene, but with Sophia, but in a private playground that probably had equipment designed by architects and maintained by professional landscapers. It would be beautiful, certainly, but would it be better? Would Sophia be happier playing alone on perfect equipment, or would she benefit more from the chaos and community of a public park, where she'd learn to navigate social dynamics and share space with children from different backgrounds? The questions felt overwhelming, complex in ways that Maya hadn't anticipated. Taking care of Sophia wouldn't just mean changing diapers and preparing bottles and making sure she was safe and healthy. It would mean helping to shape who she became, making thousands of daily decisions that would influence her understanding of the world and her place in it. Maya's apartment felt smaller than usual when she climbed the stairs that evening, but also more precious. This was her space, modest though it was, filled with things she had chosen and arranged according to her own preferences. The check was still on the kitchen table, pale blue and patient, waiting for her to decide what it represented: charity or gratitude, an ending or a beginning. She made dinner from ingredients that represented careful shopping and strategic budgeting. Pasta with vegetables that were a day past their prime but still good, seasoned with herbs she'd grown on the windowsill because buying fresh herbs was a luxury she couldn't usually afford. As she ate, Maya watched the street below, observing the evening routines of neighbors who had become part of the rhythm of her daily life. Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden with the careful attention of someone who understood that nurturing growing things required patience and consistency. Mr. Kim was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his gas station, probably for the second time that day because keeping things clean was part of his personal standard of pride. Tommy from the auto shop drove by with his windows down, waving at Mrs. Patterson as he passed because that's what people did in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's name. Maya had found belonging here, the kind of community that accepted you based on your actions rather than your background or your bank account. She mattered to these people in small but real ways, and they mattered to her in return. Leaving would mean abandoning that sense of place and purpose for something unknown and potentially wonderful, but also potentially isolating. But staying would mean accepting that this was as good as her life was going to get, that dreams deferred were dreams abandoned, that the check on her kitchen table represented not opportunity, but settlement for a life lived within careful boundaries that kept her safe but small. Maya went to bed that night with more questions than answers, but with the growing certainty that she was going to have to choose between the life she had built and the life that David Ashford was offering her. Both options held appeal and risk in equal measure, and both would require her to trust in futures she couldn't predict or control. The check remained on the kitchen table, patient and persistent, waiting for Maya to decide what kind of person she wanted to be and what kind of life she was willing to risk everything to pursue. Tomorrow, she would have to start making decisions that would determine not just her own future, but the future of a baby whose life she had already saved once, and who might need saving in different ways for years to come. Maya cashed the check on Friday morning, standing in line at First National Bank behind Mrs. Henderson and trying to appear casual about depositing more money than she'd ever held at one time. The teller, a young woman named Jessica, who Maya recognized from high school but had never really known, processed the transaction with professional discretion, though her eyebrows rose slightly when she saw the amount. "Big day," she said, with a smile that managed to be both friendly and curious. "Something like that," Maya replied, accepting the deposit receipt that represented the first time in her adult life that her bank balance had 5 digits. The money felt real now, present in her account in ways that made the job offer feel real too, significant and immediate rather than abstract possibility. Maya drove to the medical center after the bank, using the last of her car's questionable reliability to make the trip she had been postponing for months. The oncology billing department was located in the basement, a fluorescent-lit maze of cubicles where people who had survived cancer came to negotiate with the financial aftermath of staying alive. Patricia Gonzalez had been Maya's point of contact throughout her mother's treatment and the payment plan negotiations that followed. She was a kind woman with tired eyes who had seen too many families destroyed by medical bills that turned life-saving treatment into a form of financial torture that lasted years beyond the original illness. Patricia said, Maya, looking up from her computer screen with surprise and something that might have been relief, "I wasn't expecting you until next month. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Maya replied, pulling out her checkbook with hands that trembled slightly from the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I'd like to pay off the remaining balance on my mother's account." Patricia's surprise deepened as she pulled up the file and recited numbers that Maya had memorized through months of careful budgeting and strategic payment arrangements. $18,437. The remainder of bills that had once totaled more than $60,000, representing not just her mother's cancer treatment, but the ongoing costs of trying to save someone who couldn't be saved, no matter how much money you threw at the problem.
Maya wrote the check with careful precision, her handwriting neat and controlled, despite the emotional weight of what the payment represented. She was not just clearing a debt, she was closing a chapter that had defined the past 3 years of her life, eliminating the monthly reminder of loss that arrived in her mailbox with the reliability of grief itself. "This clears everything," Patricia confirmed, processing the payment with the efficiency of someone who had handled countless transactions, but rarely ones that represented complete resolution. "Your mother's account is paid in full." Maya nodded, accepting the receipt that officially ended her obligation to a medical system that had done everything it could but still couldn't perform miracles. The relief felt physical, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying in her shoulders and chest. For the first time since her mother's diagnosis, Maya could open her mail without dread, could think about her future without the constant calculation of how much she owed and how long it would take to pay it back. Driving home, Maya felt lighter, but also unmoored. The medical bills had been a burden, but they'd also been a connection to her mother, a monthly remembrance of loss that kept her grief sharp and immediate. Without them, Maya would have to find new ways to honor her mother's memory, new purposes to give her life meaning beyond the satisfaction of meeting obligations to the dead. The guest house on David Ashford's estate was nothing like Maya had imagined. Catherine had driven her out on Saturday morning for what she called a casual visit, though nothing about the 40-minute drive through increasingly expensive neighborhoods felt casual to Maya. The main house was visible from the road, a sprawling modernist structure that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. But the guest house was tucked away behind a grove of oak trees, private and self-contained. It was larger than Maya's current apartment, with hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out on gardens that were probably maintained by a team of professional landscapers. The kitchen had granite countertops and appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant. The bathroom was spacious enough for a king-size bed and still have room for a sitting area. The bathroom had a soaking tub and a shower with multiple heads that promised the kind of water pressure Maya had only experienced in expensive hotels. "It's beautiful," Maya said, and meant it, though beautiful felt inadequate for describing space that represented more luxury than she'd ever expected to occupy. "David had it renovated last year," Catherine explained, opening windows to let in the late October air that smelled like expensive landscaping and possibilities. The main house was visible from the road, a sprawling modernist structure that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. But the guest house was tucked away behind a grove of oak trees, private and self-contained. It was larger than Maya's current apartment, with hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out on gardens that were probably maintained by a team of professional landscapers. The kitchen had granite countertops and appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant. The bathroom was spacious enough for a king-size bed and still have room for a sitting area. The bathroom had a soaking tub and a shower with multiple heads that promised the kind of water pressure Maya had only experienced in expensive hotels. "It's beautiful," Maya said, and meant it, though beautiful felt inadequate for describing space that represented more luxury than she'd ever expected to occupy. "David had it renovated last year," Catherine explained, opening windows to let in the late October air that smelled like expensive landscaping and possibilities. "The previous nanny lived here for 3 years before she got married and moved to Seattle. It's completely private. There's a separate entrance and parking, so you'd never feel like you were living in someone else's space."
Maya explored the guest house with the wonder of someone discovering that fantasies could become reality if the right combination of circumstances aligned properly. Every detail spoke of money spent without constraint. Custom cabinetry, imported tile, light fixtures that were probably worth more than Maya made in a month. But despite the luxury, the space felt warm and livable, designed for comfort rather than display. "What would my responsibilities be?" Maya asked, running her hand along the kitchen counter that felt smooth and cool under her palm. "Primary care for Sophia during normal business hours, feeding, changing, playing, developmental activities appropriate for her age. David usually handles bath time and bedtime himself. Those are important bonding moments for him, and he doesn't want to give them up unless he's traveling for business. You'd also help with household management related to Sophia's needs, shopping for baby supplies, coordinating with her pediatrician, organizing playdates with other children her age. David has a housekeeper who handles general cleaning and maintenance, so you wouldn't be responsible for anything beyond Sophia's immediate environment." Maya nodded, trying to imagine herself in this role, in this space, caring for a baby whose trust fund probably contained more money than most people would see in their lifetimes. It felt surreal, like she was touring someone else's life rather than considering making it her own. "Can I meet Sophia again? Before I make a final decision, I mean. I'd like to spend some time with her when she's not choking. See how we get along in normal circumstances." Catherine smiled with the approval of someone whose judgment had been validated. "David was hoping you would ask. He's at the main house now with Sophia if you'd like to walk over." The main house was even more impressive up close, all clean lines and glass walls that blurred the distinction between indoor and outdoor space. I found myself walking more quietly as we approached, intimidated by architecture that spoke of wealth beyond my comprehension. But when Catherine opened the front door and called out their arrival, the space immediately felt more human. David emerged from what appeared to be a living room, carrying Sophia on his hip with the casual competence of someone who had learned to navigate parenthood despite having no template for single fatherhood. He was dressed more casually than he had been at the diner. Jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Maya's monthly car payment, but looked comfortable and lived in. "Maya, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would."
"Thank you for inviting me," Maya replied, suddenly aware of her own clothing, the best jeans she owned and a sweater from Target that was only 2 years old. She felt underdressed and out of place, but David's manner was so warm and unassuming that her discomfort began to fade almost immediately. Sophia remembered her. The baby smiled when she saw Maya, reaching out with chubby arms in the universal gesture of a child who wanted to be held. Maya accepted the transfer carefully, marveling again at how solid and real Sophia felt, how her presence could make everything else feel more grounded and purposeful. "She has been babbling about strangers all week," David said, watching Maya hold his daughter with an expression that mixed gratitude and something that might have been hope. "I think she's ready to expand her social circle beyond me and Catherine and Mrs. Morrison, our housekeeper." Maya bounced Sophia gently, making the kind of nonsense sounds that adults automatically produced around babies. Sophia giggled and grabbed at Maya's hair. Her coordination improved since their first meeting, but still endearingly clumsy. There was something about holding her that felt right, natural in ways that Maya hadn't expected but couldn't deny. "Would you like a tour?" David asked. "I know the house is probably overwhelming, but I'd like you to see Sophia's nursery, get a sense of her daily routine." The nursery was a study in thoughtful design, clearly planned by someone who understood that children needed stimulation and comfort in equal measure. The walls were painted in soft pastels that managed to avoid being overly feminine or masculine. Toys were organized in baskets that encouraged exploration without creating chaos. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the afternoon light that made reading aloud feel warm and intimate. "Yelena designed this room," David said quietly, running his hand along the crib rail with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. She spent hours researching child development, color psychology, how to create spaces that would encourage creativity and confidence. She wanted Sophia to feel safe here,
but also curious about the world beyond these walls. I could see Yelena's influence throughout the room, in the carefully chosen artwork that depicted adventures rather than passive scenes, in the bookshelf filled with volumes that suggested reading was both pleasure and priority, in the mobile above the crib that featured birds in flight rather than static decorations. It was the nursery of someone who had planned to be actively involved in her daughter's development, someone who had understood that good parenting required intention and attention rather than just love and luck. She would have been an amazing mother, Maya said, meaning it, though she'd never met Yelena and knew her only through the choices reflected in this room. She would have, David agreed, his voice thick with the grief that was probably always present but usually better controlled. Sometimes I lie awake at night worrying that I can't give Sophia everything Yelena would have provided, the emotional intelligence, the intuitive understanding of what children need, the patience that comes naturally to some people but feels like work to others. Maya bounced Sophia, who had begun to fuss slightly at the shift in emotional tone that often accompanied conversations about her mother. "But you love her," Maya said, simply, "and that's not nothing. Love doesn't solve everything, but it's the foundation for solving most things." David looked at her with surprise and something that might have been relief. That's exactly what Yelena would have said. She believed that love was a skill you could develop, that caring about someone meant learning how to care for them properly. They spent the next hour in Sophia's company, playing the kind of simple games that entertained babies and reminded adults why childhood was worth protecting. Sophia showed off her crawling skills, her ability to clap her hands, her impressive lung capacity when she decided she wanted something that was just out of reach. Maya found herself relaxing into the interaction, remembering why she'd always felt most like herself when caring for children. "What questions do you have?" David asked as Sophia began to show signs of needing her afternoon nap. About the job, the living situation, anything at all. Maya had prepared a mental list of practical concerns. Health insurance details, vacation time, what would happen if she decided the job wasn't working out. But sitting in Sophia's nursery, watching David prepare his daughter for sleep with the careful attention of someone who had learned to find joy in routine caregiving tasks, the practical questions felt less important than the emotional ones. What if I'm not good at this? I'm good with kids in general, but she's your daughter. She's going to grow up with every advantage money can provide, and I'm going to be helping to shape who she becomes. What if I make mistakes that matter? David settled Sophia into her crib with practiced efficiency, then turned to face Maya with an expression that mixed understanding and determination. "You're going to make mistakes," he said matter-of-factly. "I make mistakes every day, and I'm her father. Parenting isn't about perfection, it's about showing up consistently and caring enough to learn from the mistakes when they happen."
"But you saved her life without thinking twice," he continued. "You acted on instinct, and your instincts were perfect. I trust those instincts more than I trust credentials or experience or any of the other qualifications that look good on paper but don't necessarily translate to good caregiving." Maya watched Sophia settle into sleep, her small face relaxing into the peaceful expression that made sleeping babies look like advertisements for the possibility of innocence. She was beautiful and healthy and surrounded by every material advantage imaginable, but she was also motherless and vulnerable in ways that money couldn't protect against. "When would you need me to start?" Maya asked, surprising herself with the question, but recognizing that she had already made her decision somewhere in the process of holding Sophia and seeing how David looked at his daughter. "Whenever you're ready," David replied. "I know you'll need to give notice at the diner, tie up loose ends in Knowbrook. There's no rush. I've waited this long to find the right person, and I can wait a little longer if it means doing this properly." Maya nodded, thinking about conversations she would need to have with Dolores, with Mrs. Rodriguez and the other regulars who had become part of her daily routine, with Mrs. Chen downstairs who would need to find a new tenant for the apartment that had been Maya's refuge during the most difficult period of her life. 2 weeks, she said finally. "I can give my notice on Monday and start here 2 weeks from then, if that works for you." David's smile was radiant, transforming his face in ways that made Maya understand why Elena had fallen in love with him, why someone who could have had anything had chosen to build a life with this particular person. "That works perfectly. Catherine will handle all the details, employment contracts,
health insurance enrollment, anything you need to make the transition as smooth as possible. As Maya prepared to leave the Ashford estate, she found herself taking one last look around the guest house that would soon become her home. It was beautiful and comfortable and represented opportunities she'd never dared to imagine for herself. But it was also intimidating in ways that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with the responsibility she was accepting. Caring for Sophia wouldn't just be a job. It would be a trust that extended beyond professional obligations into the realm of love and commitment that couldn't be measured in salary or benefits. Maya would be helping to raise a child who would grow up privileged but motherless, wealthy but potentially isolated, loved but marked by loss in ways that would shape her understanding of the world. The drive back to Millbrook felt like traveling between different universes, each with its own rules and expectations and possibilities. Maya's small apartment above the hardware store never looked more modest than it did that evening, but it also never felt more precious. This was where she had learned to live alone, where she had grieved her mother and built a new identity as an independent adult who could take care of herself and others. Leaving would be harder than Maya had anticipated, not because Millbrook was perfect, but because it had been home during a time when she needed to discover who she could become when everything familiar had been stripped away. The job at Mercy's Diner had been more than employment. It had been proof that she could be useful and valued, that her presence mattered to people who had no obligation to care about her beyond the brief interactions that bracketed their meals. Maya spent Sunday walking through Millbrook with new eyes, paying attention to details she'd grown accustomed to seeing without noticing. The way autumn light made even the most ordinary buildings look touched by magic. The way people greeted each other on the street with casual familiarity that spoke of shared history and mutual concern. The way children played in yards where their parents could watch from kitchen windows while preparing dinner or folding laundry. It was a good place, Maya realized. Not perfect, not without its limitations and small-town complications, but good in ways that money couldn't purchase or replicate. She would miss it, miss the sense of belonging that came from being known and needed in modest but meaningful ways. But she would also miss the woman she had been in Millbrook if she stayed. The woman who saved babies because it was the right thing to do, who worked hard and cared about people and dreamed of futures that extended beyond the boundaries of immediate necessity. Maya spent Sunday walking through Millbrook with new eyes, paying attention to details she'd grown accustomed to seeing without noticing. The way autumn light made even the most ordinary buildings look touched by magic. The way people greeted each other on the street with casual familiarity that spoke of shared history and mutual concern. The way children played in yards where their parents could watch from kitchen windows while preparing dinner or folding laundry. It was a good place, Maya realized. Not perfect, not without its limitations and small-town complications, but good in ways that money couldn't purchase or replicate. She would miss it, miss the sense of belonging that came from being known and needed in modest but meaningful ways. But she would also miss the woman she had been in Millbrook if she stayed. The woman who saved babies because it was the right thing to do, who worked hard and cared about people and dreamed of futures that extended beyond the boundaries of immediate necessity. Maya went to bed Sunday night knowing that tomorrow she would begin the process of ending one chapter of her life and starting another. The check had been cashed, the job offer accepted, the future set in motion by decisions that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Sophia would wake up in her crib in the nursery Elena had designed, and in 2 weeks, Maya would be the one to greet her good morning and help her navigate the day ahead. It was a responsibility that felt too large for someone who learned about caregiving through trial and error, rather than professional training. But it was also an opportunity to matter in ways that extended beyond serving coffee and remembering how customers like their eggs. Maya would be helping to shape a life, to provide the love and attention that every child deserved, but that money couldn't guarantee. The woman who slept in Millbrook that night was the same one who saved Sophia's life without thinking twice.
But the woman who would wake up the next morning to give notice at Mercy's diner was someone new. Someone who chose possibility over security, love over fear, a future she couldn't predict over a present she understood completely.
Maya's last shift at Mercy's diner began like any other Monday morning, except for the weight of words she carried in her chest. The resignation letter folded in her uniform pocket, written and rewritten until the paper was soft from handling. She'd practiced the conversation with Dolores a dozen times in her mirror, but facing the reality of disappointing people who had come to depend on her felt heavier than any rehearsal could prepare her for. The morning rush was particularly busy, as if the universe had conspired to remind Maya of everything she would be leaving behind. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived early for her usual coffee and pie, commenting that Maya looked different somehow, more alive than she'd seemed in months. Tony the trucker was in an especially good mood, sharing pictures of his granddaughter's first steps while Maya refilled his coffee cup. Even Mr. Henderson cracked a rare smile when Maya remembered, without being asked, that he preferred his toast just barely golden. "Dolores," Maya said during the brief lull between breakfast and lunch, finding her boss in the cramped office that smelled of coffee grounds and decades of accumulated paperwork. "I need to talk to you about something important." Dolores looked up from the invoices she was reviewing, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose in a way that made her look older and more vulnerable than her usual gruff persona suggested. "If this is about asking for a raise, the answer's still no. Business is good, but it ain't that good." "It's not about money," Maya said, pulling the letter from her pocket with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice. I've accepted another position." The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with the sound of the coffee machine hissing and Jimmy singing off-key in the kitchen. Dolores removed her glasses slowly, studying Maya with the sharp attention of someone who had been reading people's intentions for longer than Maya had been alive. "What kind of position?" Dolores asked finally, her voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was bracing for disappointment. Maya explained about Sophia, about David, about the opportunity to care for a child who needed someone who would love her fiercely and without reservation. She didn't mention the salary or the guest house or the health insurance that would eliminate the careful calculations that had governed her life for so long. Those details felt too large to share, too disconnected from the world they both inhabited at Mercy's diner. "A nanny," Dolores said when Maya finished, and there was something in her tone that might have been approval mixed with resignation. "For rich people. For a little girl who lost her mother, who needs someone who will put her first, always." Dolores nodded slowly, refolding Maya's resignation letter with the precision of someone who understood that some changes were inevitable, even when they weren't welcome. "You saved that baby's life. Makes sense they'd want you around to keep doing it." The conversation was interrupted by the lunch rush, but throughout the afternoon, Maya found herself having variations of the same discussion with customers who would become part of her daily routine. Mrs. Rodriguez teared up when Maya explained she would be leaving, pressing a $20 tip into her hand despite Maya's protests. Tony the trucker made her promise to send him a Christmas card from her new life, because some connections deserved to survive geographical distance. The hardest conversation was with Jimmy, who would become something like an older brother during Maya's time at Mercy's diner. He listened to her explanation while mechanically chopping vegetables for the dinner prep, his weathered hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who had been cooking for 40 years. "You're going to be good at it," he said finally, not looking up from his cutting board. "Taking care of that little girl. You got the right heart for it. And that matters more than all the fancy training in the world." "I'm going to miss this place," Maya said, meaning it more than she had expected to. "Place'll miss you too. But missing ain't the worst thing. Means something mattered, you know? Means it was real." Maya's final shift ended at 4 p.m. on a Friday that felt both ordinary and momentous. She cleaned her section one last time, wiped down tables that someone else would be responsible for on Monday, said goodbye to the coffee machine that had been temperamental but reliable throughout her tenure. Dolores emerged from her office to shake Maya's hand with awkward formality, pressing an envelope into her palm that contained her final paycheck and a handwritten note that Maya wouldn't read until she was alone. The note was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "You made this place better just by being in it. Take care of yourself and that baby. D." Maya drove to the Ashford estate on Saturday morning with her belongings packed into boxes that represented 2 years of small-town life. Her furniture would go to the donation center. The guest house was fully furnished, and Maya's second-hand table and mismatched chairs would look ridiculous in spaces designed by professional decorators. But she kept her mother's reading glasses, the plants she had rescued and nursed back to health, and the coffee mug from Mercy's Diner that Dolores had given her as a parting gift. David met her at the guest house with Sophia in his arms and an expression that mixed gratitude and nervousness in equal measure. Sophia remembered Maya, reaching for her with chubby arms and the complete trust that only very young children could offer to adults who had proven themselves worthy of it. "Welcome home," David said as Maya settled Sophia on her hip, and the words felt both foreign and exactly right.
The transition was easier than Maya had expected, and harder in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sophia was an easy baby, curious and affectionate and quick to laugh at Maya's silly faces and nonsense songs. The work itself felt natural, an extension of instincts Maya had been developing since she was old enough to help care for younger children in her neighborhood. But living in luxury felt strange for someone who had learned to find joy in simple pleasures and small victories. The guest house was beautiful and comfortable, but Maya found herself missing the sounds of Mrs. Chen cooking dinner downstairs, the familiar creak of old floorboards, the view of Main Street, where she could watch her neighbors' daily routines unfold like a gentle television program designed specifically for her entertainment. David was kind and respectful, careful to give Maya space while making it clear that she was welcome in the main house whenever Sophia's needs required it. He was also struggling in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the particular challenges of single parenthood, when every decision felt weighted with the possibility of irrevocable harm. "Am I doing this right?" he asked Maya one evening as they watched Sophia play with blocks on the living room floor. "Raising her alone, I mean. Elena would have known instinctively what Sophia needed at every stage. I feel like I'm constantly guessing, hoping that love is enough to compensate for everything I don't understand about children." "Love is more than enough," Maya assured him, watching Sophia knock down a tower of blocks and clap her hands in delight at the destruction she had created. "And you're not raising her alone anymore. She has both of us now, and that's not nothing." 3 months into her new life, Maya received a letter from Mrs. Rodriguez, written in the careful cursive of someone who had learned penmanship when it was considered essential to education. The letter was full of Millbrook news. Dolores had hired a new waitress who was efficient but lacked Maya's warmth. Tony had become a grandfather again. Mrs. Patterson was teaching neighborhood children how to plant spring gardens. "We miss you," the letter concluded, "but we're proud of you too. You were always meant for bigger things than this little town could offer. Take care of that precious baby, and remember that you have family here whenever you need us." Maya read the letter while Sophia napped, sitting in the garden that professional landscapers maintained with mathematical precision. She missed Millbrook more than she'd expected to, missed the uncomplicated relationships and the sense of being needed in modest but meaningful ways. But she also felt useful here, important in ways that extended beyond professional competence into the realm of love and commitment that couldn't be measured or replaced. Sophia was thriving under Maya's care, developing the confidence that came from being consistently loved and attended to by adults who put her needs first. She was walking now,
toddling around the house with the fearless determination of someone who had never been given reason to doubt that the world was safe and welcoming. She called Maya Maymay and David Dada with equal enthusiasm, treating them both as essential components of her small but secure universe. Maya had found her calling, she realized, watching Sophia discover the joy of puddles after an autumn rainstorm. Not just as a caregiver, but as someone who could provide the love and stability that every child deserved, but that money alone couldn't guarantee. She was helping to raise a little girl who would grow up privileged but not spoiled, wealthy but not disconnected from the humanity that made privilege meaningful rather than merely comfortable. The woman who had saved Sophia's life that night at Mercy's diner had become the woman who was helping her learn to walk, to speak, to navigate a world that would offer her every advantage, but that would also require her to become someone worthy of those advantages. It was the most important work Maya had ever done, and the most rewarding. Not because of the salary or the benefits, but because love had found its proper outlet in service to someone who needed it completely. Maya's story had become Sophia's story too, their lives intertwined in ways that would shape them both for years to come. And in the guest house that had become home, surrounded by gardens that bloomed with professional precision but were explored with childlike wonder, Maya finally understood what it meant to find your purpose in loving someone else's child as fiercely as if she were your own. Subscribe to Waitress Chronicles, where silence is never forgotten.